On va commencer par Madame Marit Jorgensen, directeur de EuroMediterranean de droits humains Network Project. Please, Madame Jorgensen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And first of all, I want to thank all the organizers for inviting us to participate in this interesting event. I assume that I have 10 minutes or something to allow us for some discussions and debate afterwards.
Please make it 8 minutes just to be on time. Thank you very much for your attention and your comprehension.
I will try to do that. And if you see me waving kind of strangely in that direction, it's because I'm trying to coordinate a PowerPoint presentation. So I will try. I want to make 3 brief points in these 8 minutes. I want to very briefly say a few words about the EuroMediterranean Human Rights Network so that you know who I am and why I speak on this issue. Then I want to strongly stress the linkage between women's rights women as actors in the political life and in public life, and the link to women's rights in private and family life. I think it's an important point to stress. Then I want to go on to talk a little about EU policies after, in relation to the EU Spring, and especially in relation to gender. And I want to make a few recommendations for all of us in relation to this. So the first slide is about the mission of the network. We are a network of NGOs, so non-governmental organizations. We work to promote and strengthen human rights and democratic reform in the Euromed region, and we work to forge partnerships between NGOs in the Euromed region. Among our key values is gender equality and the importance of actively promoting the rights of women and their right to participate in public and political life. So we have a gender mainstreaming policy within the network, and we have a gender equality commitment. So I would say that gender is a very important key value for the network. We are about 80 member organizations today. This means it's both national human rights organizations, it's regional organizations, and it's also academic institutions. And our members come from about 30 different countries in the Euromed region. We have offices in Brussels and Paris. We have branches in Rabat, Amman, and Cairo. And we have just quite recently opened what we call a mission in Tunisia to accompany the development and strengthening of civil society there. In relation to the activities we do, we very much focus on exchange and dialogue between members. And I think that in the previous panel, there were speakers talking about the importance of really engaging North and South, that we kind of share the Mediterranean and that it's important to work together. So we very much support this principle in terms of exchange and dialogue between members, and we have a principle on equal partnership, so it's not like the northern organizations setting the agenda and the southerns implementing them, but actually we do work together on an equal level. We give assistance to members. It could either be in terms of trial monitorings, it could be in terms of press releases, or it could also be in terms of giving them access to, for example, EU institutions or to our network of members. We do lobbying activities. We have an office in Brussels that works towards the EU institutions, and we focus on building the capacity of members, again, built on their needs through trainings. Let me just speak about gender again, or come back to the gender issue. We work in thematic working groups, and we have a working group on gender which brings together about 15 to 20 organizations in the Euromed region, women's rights organizations as well as generalist human rights organizations, because we have found out that there's a tendency that women's rights organizations focus very much on issues that are traditionally women's rights issues, but perhaps not so much on political economic issues, while the generalist human rights organization would say, oh, all this that has to do with women and gender, there are the specific organizations dealing with that. And we would like the women's rights organizations to really see the importance of mainstreaming gender in politics and economics, in social fields, and we would like the generalist human rights organizations to see that gender is something that is part of human rights, an integral part of human rights that they need to work on. When we brought these 15 representatives of 15 organizations together, there were two issues that we agreed would be important to work on in the EuroMed region. One was the Istanbul-Marrakesh process, and there is a little information in the folder we got about this process. In 2006 in Istanbul, the ministers of equality or family or social development, it depends a little from country to country, met ministers from the EU and the partner countries, and they committed themselves to an Istanbul plan of action, which was basically on enhancing gender equality and women's rights in the EuroMed region. And this commitment was reconfirmed in Marrakesh in 2009, and interestingly, it was taken a step further by saying that the partners should develop national action plans in order to enhance women's rights. And we found that this is really an interesting and important instrument to enhance women's rights and gender equality in the region. And finally, we agreed that gender mainstreaming is really an important principle. And by gender mainstreaming, we mean two things. We mean integrating gender in all policies, but it also means that you can take specific action in order to give women equal access with men. So I think it's important to recall the two legs of gender mainstreaming. Let me briefly then turn to talking about the EU policies. I want to briefly mention that I think when we talk about women's rights in private life, there are many, many aspects, and I think we covered a lot in the first session on political rights, in the other session on economic and social rights. I think when we talk about private life, and if we talk very legalistic, I think the personal status laws really kind of put the unequal relationship between men and women very clearly, making men the head of the family and the guardians of women. And I think a lot of the reform initiatives have focused on improving women's lots as wives and as mothers. But what I think happened during the Arab Spring, there's been obviously also organizations working on it before, but what was very interesting in the Arab Spring was that you had, as many of you mentioned, women participating in the demonstrations, being in the forefront, being at Tahrir Square, but they didn't call for women's rights as such. They called for equal citizenship and equal rights. And I think this really, that seeing women's rights as human rights and women calling for that is really an important development. And I think this is, it again shows the linkage between the private and the public. And I think that it really links women's participation in political and public life to the changing of women's status affecting private and family life. So I think it's really important that we keep this linkage in mind, and that we, as a consequence, also look at gender mainstreaming of the transition processes, because as I think a colleague mentioned this morning, we can see that women have and are still very active, but we also see some very worrying trends in relation to a marginalization of women in the processes that are happening. So I think it's really important to keep on focusing on embedding the principle of gender equality in the constitutions, in the committees that are going to be set up, also, as you mentioned, in Libya, really to make sure that women are there. If we look at the EU and the Arab Spring, EU has made two joint communications since, one in March and one in June. It's very promising as they talk about supporting democracy, the mutual commitment to rule of law, and so on. And they also, what is interesting is that they put quite a strong conditionality. The countries that make the more progress will get more money. The ones who do less will get less. But when it comes to gender, It's very sad to see that the benchmarks do not include gender. There's in one of the communications a little on kind of job creation and in women in economic development, but that's all. There's nothing about equal participation of women in political and public life. There's nothing on non-discrimination based on sex or combating gender-based discrimination and violence. And there is no gender mainstreaming of the documents. So I think here, and I will end on that note with my recommendations, I think it's really important that we all, many of you as parliamentarians, some of you from the EU, others, and see all of us, men and women, as activists, that we really promote women's political participation and women's participation in public life during the transitions as a prerequisite not only for democracy, but also for change in women's status in private and family life. And also that we promote gender mainstreaming as a leading principle in relation to the transitions. And also that we promote the universal principles as outlined in CEDAW, the Convention Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, in order not to accept any excuses of cultural and religious relativism. It doesn't mean that we should not listen to women in the region, on the contrary, but we should not accept the excuses that this is not universal and now we have the revolution, so this is more important than women's rights and so on. And I think it's important that we hold the EU responsible and say that they will lose their credibility if they don't implement their joint commitments to gender equality. Again, the paper you got in your folder, there's a lot on all the commitments that the EU has done. It's time that they start implementing them also, and especially for example, in the future ENP progress reports, in the new generation of ENP action plans, I would very much like to see a strong statement on gender. And also in relation to the Istanbul-Marrakesh process, the Union for the Mediterranean, with which it's under now, we have called for an expert meeting, and they have actually been part of what was in the Marrakesh conclusions that should take place. And I very much would urge and hope that this meeting will be set up, and that there will also be a EuroMed summit in 2012 to discuss the enhancement of gender equality and women's rights. I think it's really a window of opportunity that should be seized.